Thanks, Sarah. And I almost made it to Cornell. Once I met Bob Plaisted years ago, probably 20-some years ago, and he said something, and I said, oh, I had applied there, and he said, oh, I'm really sorry, it didn't work out. And I said, no, it did work out, but I didn't come. I went to Minnesota instead. I had lived 4 years in Davis, and I thought, I'm going to try not being in a college town for a while. So sometimes you make decisions. But anyway, it's lovely to be back here. Used to get up here a lot when Steve Kresovich was teaching a course on plant genetics policy and such, genetic resource policy, and we always look to Cornell as a great partner in our endeavors, and I think you'll be seeing some of that in what Saharah Moon and I are going to talk about today. So, so this is something that everybody has seen. My point about showing you this is that we could have put this slide up 10 years ago, and at that time there was very little interest, at least in Washington and in other donor agencies, the World Bank, other DFID and others, very little interest in agriculture. The sole exception was about a little less than 10 years ago, the Gates Foundation did the hard analysis on, what else should we be investing in? And of course, adding to health and education, they chose agriculture. And that was based on analysis. So we knew these things about agriculture, but we couldn't get the attention of policymakers around the world. And then you also know what happened about 5 years ago. There's a lot of things that people talked about at the time. Was it the drought in Australia? Was it biofuels? Was it policy changes around stocks? Frankly, and I know there's a lot of factors here, but my sense on this is that the real underlying issues were none of those. Those were factors, but not the underlying issues. The underlying issues were really two things, I think. One was a growing rate in demand that had to do with income growth leading to dietary shifts and more in cereal-intensive foods, shift towards animal agriculture products. And the second piece was the fact that what we'd been experiencing for the last 40 years was a linear growth in productivity. And a linear growth in productivity leads to a declining rate of productivity growth over time. So in other words, if we're going at the same increment, 50 kilograms per hectare 30 years ago was a much higher percentage than 50 kilograms per hectare was, say, in 2003 or 2004. So you had these two factors, I think, underlying what was a structural problem. It wasn't just a spike, although we had breakfast this morning with Per, and we know that prices have come back down some, but they're still above the low levels that we saw at the beginning of the decade. And what happened was that the price spikes in 2008 caused a lot of disturbances around the world. And once again, we were back on the agenda of the development community. And you might recall that in President Obama's first inaugural address, he actually spoke about working with developing countries to help make their farmers' fields flourish. It was a nice alliterative phrase. And I have to tell you, I was standing there and I could not believe that the President of the United States was actually talking about what we do as part of his administration's agenda going forward. And what that led to was what's called Feed the Future, which is a presidential initiative. It's a whole of government. But this is pretty much listing there the focuses that are the things that make it special. I think that what stands out are the idea that it's country-led. That means that if our partner countries don't prioritize something, neither do we. In other words, if they're not going to make it a priority, there's probably not much reason for us to do it. Women and gender, very clear. Agriculture, nutrition. This is something that used to be a given 30 years ago, and Per knows this, that we thought those communities at least were often connected, if not adequately so. But with agriculture falling off the development agenda in the 90s, nutrition increasingly allied with things like maternal and child health and child survival, all of which is great stuff, but it wasn't as much about food. So now I think we've brought that back. I think the other things I'll be saying more about, and also everywhere is just as I'm sure it is here, we all live in an accountability culture, and we have a strong emphasis on monitoring and evaluation and impact analysis. And then the what we do. That was the how, this is the what. And as you can see there, I've highlighted the R&D piece because that's what Saharah, Moon, and I will be talking about. But you can see it's about producing more, getting more food to market, policy, and again, this coming back to how do we link agricultural growth to nutrition impacts at the level of particularly the rural populations where poverty and stunting are the highest. So we had this emerge, and the question is, what do we do in terms of our research agenda? Now, the Feed the Future, as I just said, the bottom line, at the end of the day, what we're aiming for is a reduction in poverty and a reduction in stunting. The latter, in particular, is an incredibly high bar for agricultural investments. It's one that I'm still daunted by and we're still struggling with. So we started out saying, all right, where's the poverty? Well, it's actually concentrated in rural areas. This is, you can see both the prevalence on the left and the numbers of people on the right. You see numbers of people, South Asia tends to blow the rest of the world out of the water. In Africa, the prevalence is very high. The thing that is not visible here is that if we lowered that threshold to 50 cents a day, sub-Saharan Africa really comes up in terms of the numbers. And then we looked at child stunting. And again, you see while there are problems around the world, again, concentrated in those two regions, sub-Saharan Africa and especially South Asia. So when we put those two things together, we did that analysis and we came up with a research strategy that has an overarching goal of what we call sustainable intensification, and we'll say more about that. Three research themes emerged. The productivity frontier, which is what I think most of you would think of when you think of ag research, could be plant breeding, could be vaccines, a whole range, agronomy, a whole range of things that are traditional aspects of ag research. Then we had this idea of transforming production systems, and this is in order to get to that sustainable intensification outcome. And that's in particular the pieces at the level of the farmer's field and the agricultural production system. And then finally, because of the emphasis we had on nutritional outcomes, we tried to elevate that within our strategy around both nutrition and food safety. Then 4 geographies emerged as well from our analysis. And this is where you see that the poverty and hunger are actually concentrated in the main agricultural producing areas. These are where the people live. So we have the Indo-Gangetic Plains, the Sudano-Sahelian zone, the Ethiopian highlands, and the mixed maize-based systems of Eastern and Southern Africa. So these were the things that led us to the basic tenets of our strategy. So then for AID, what we did is we had to make choices. So we chose 3 long-term research major themes: heat and drought tolerant cereals, advanced technological solutions for animal and plant diseases. And this is recognizing that the United States may not have programs in cassava and banana and a lot of other things, but we do have science that we can bring to bear. Same thing on the animal health issues. And the third thing on the long-term research agenda is the legume productivity. You can see we're talking about long-term to near-term on the left-hand side. Then we have this middle area where we talk about things like policy and social science, nutrition, dietary diversification through the enhancement of the quality and type of foods available. And finally, bringing it all together at the level of the farming system, the sustainable intensification, which is where the research strategy meets the development strategy that our missions. Recalling that in Feed the Future, we have about 20 focus countries that more or less align, not completely, but more or less align with the regions I talked about. Those missions have the bulk of the resources. They are particularly invested in value chain approaches. What we're trying to do then is mesh, in this part of our strategy, mesh our R&D investments with those outcomes. Now, so then at the institutional level in AID, the Board on International Food and Agricultural Development led a study of our university programs, and reviewed what we were doing presently as well as what we had in our new strategy. And from that whole process, we set up what we call the Food Security Innovation Center. And there are 7 program areas under that, and they reflect really the strategy that I just laid out for you. But I think this is where we turn it over to Saharah Moon, who's going to walk through the most of the program areas. And I think we have to change this.
Can you get this out? So this goes in a
pick
pocket.
in my pocket.
Sorry.
Thank you.
That can go in a pocket or.
Thanks, Kelly.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. I walk through these set of slides. I'm about to walk us through a lot. I rarely have someone set the stage so well for me as Rob just did. So that's really great. This is getting into more of the what is USAID doing in our research portfolio in this area. What are the kinds of investments we're making, and how are we working to achieve the objectives that Rob just laid out in terms of the Feed the Future initiative, and how we see R&D as contributing to those objectives. So he mentioned 3 long-term research areas. One of these is our program for research on climate-resilient cereals. This is recognizing a couple things. One is that climate change is going to hit particular cereal crops very hard. South Asia, wheat production, potential for huge yield impacts there, particularly around rising temperatures. Also in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at water availability and high temperatures. And then, of course, the suite of diseases and pest interactions that can come along with that. So this is also recognizing the fact that cereals, while they may not provide us with all the nutrition that we need, they are at the base of many, many people's diets, and also at the base of their production system. And as long as their cereal production is at risk by climatic threats, there's not a lot of space in a smallholder farmer's lifestyle to invest in other things like more nutritious foods, other sorts of income generating opportunities. So this is about stabilizing cereal yields, making them more climate resilient, giving smallholder farmers the latitude to move some of their resources and their time and their energy and their inputs into other crops. If they know that their cereal yields are going to be more stable, they can devote less land to it. So that's sort of the idea behind these investments. We're partnering with the private sector, who they have a number of technologies to bring to bear on this, both in terms of biotechnology, other advanced breeding tools. We're focusing primarily on 5 crops: rice, wheat, millet, sorghum, and pearl millet. We're working, a lot of our investments are in South Asia. In part, that's because we have really good partners in India to work with. If we're working on heat tolerance in wheat in India, we're going to be able to take the outcomes of those investments and move them across a much broader area. So India is not just necessarily the target of our investments, but it's an area where we can get really strong partnerships between international scientists, US scientists, and South Asian scientists. We're working in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They're making some very large investments, for example, in maize in Africa. We can come in with some additional targeted work. An example is the Drought Tolerant Maize for Africa program. Our resources have enabled that program to expand into heat tolerance in maize, which hadn't been a primary focus, through that partnership with the Gates Foundation. We're looking at both the yield in terms of grain for human consumption, but also looking at fodder quality as an additional trait in our breeding. And we're looking across a suite of traits, primarily abiotic stress tolerance. Heat tolerance in wheat is a very big focus for us right now. Water use efficiency and drought tolerance, but also things like nitrogen use efficiency, looking to increase production in areas where we don't have as much fertilizer, or looking to increase the yields under regular fertilizer use. At the bottom are some examples of the kinds of projects we're supporting in addition to the CGIAR research programs in these crops. We have some new innovation labs. These are what used to be called the CRISPs, have been transformed into innovation labs, and we've added a whole number of new ones to that portfolio. Rob will give you a run through of all the innovation labs towards the end. But we have some in applied wheat genomics working with Kansas State University. We have a new sorghum and millet innovation lab also with Kansas State. We're working with CIMMYT on the heat stress resilient maize. We're working with a company, Arcadia Biosciences, and the African Agricultural Technology Foundation in Africa on a program for nitrogen efficient, water efficient, salt tolerant rice in Africa. So it runs the gamut. It's one of our larger portfolio areas. Yes. The second long-term research area is our program for research on legume productivity. This is looking to both increase the productivity and the availability of legumes. The idea behind this, of course, is that legumes are highly nutritious, and it's an element of the diet we would like to increase. And it's also, production of legumes is often by women, so it's an opportunity to increase income earning opportunities for women. Abiotic stresses hit legumes particularly hard in the countries where we work. Pests and diseases are also a huge issue. And so our research investments are targeted at both the abiotic and the biotic stresses in legume production. And of course, I'm talking about the breeding here, but a lot of these programs encompass the entire value chain. So for example, we have a Grain Legumes Innovation Lab. They have investments in breeding, but they're also working across the value chain, thinking about production agronomy, thinking about how it impacts nutrition, looking at what are the best ways to integrate legumes into household consumption, what are the best ways to increase the production of legumes such that the benefits accrue to women and children on a nutritional basis. So this is an area we are also partnering with the private sector, but frankly there's a lot going on in the public sector in legume productivity. And in fact, we've just developed 4 new innovation labs in legumes, in soybean, peanut, the new ones are soy, chickpea, beans, and cowpea, and then we had existing work on legumes, peanut, and recently brought in a mycotoxin focus to our peanut work as well. Our third long-term area, Rob alluded to this, the strength that the U.S. scientific community can bring to addressing pests and diseases. So this encompasses our biotechnology work. It also, a recent addition to the portfolio, is working with animal diseases. And so we have programs in poultry genomics. We have a program on addressing Rift Valley fever disease in livestock through U.S. university collaborations. This is an area we have a lot of public-private partnerships. A lot of the private companies have technologies that they can bring either through donation to public sector entities or through partnerships between the public and the private entities to develop the crops or the tools to address diseases in animals. Again, just some examples. We're working on virus resistance in cassava in Africa. This is an issue that we have not been able to address adequately through conventional breeding, and it's a good use of a biotech tool. We're working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture on developing an East Coast fever vaccine. We're working with a private company, Venganza, on trying out different RNAi approaches to disease control. The Agricultural Biotechnology Support Program here at Cornell is working on BT eggplant, on disease-resistant banana, on disease-resistant potato. As I mentioned, there were a couple new innovation labs in the area of animal diseases as well. Just to go a little bit more into biotechnology, this is an area that gets a lot of attention, a lot of questions. We invest in biotechnology when we see it to be a tool that could bring benefits to smallholder farmers. There's a lot that the private companies are doing that we don't need to replicate. We're not addressing all of the traits that they're addressing, but there are areas where the private sector themselves may not be investing on their own. When we partner with them, we can help to alleviate some of that risk and increase the use of that tool in situations that will benefit smallholder farmers. We do a lot of capacity building. A lot of this is about building the capacity of public sector researchers to use biotech tools. We also have parallel support for organizations that are providing support to regulators and policymakers to help them better regulate the outputs of biotechnology or the research and the use of biotech tools. So this is establishing regulatory frameworks for genetically modified crops, for example. But really, fundamentally, is we're using genetic engineering where we can't, and the only reason we're using it instead of conventional breeding is conventional breeding would be faster. We don't have to deal with the regulatory issues. But there are some places we're not going to get there through conventional tools, or we think we can use a parallel approach. For example, in our cereal program I described earlier, we have several different projects just in wheat working on heat tolerance. Some are using advanced genomic tools. One of them is partnering here with scientists at Cornell. Another is working with a company and bringing in a transgene. And we're going to invest in both of those, see which one gets there first, maybe combine them at the end and have a much more robust trait. Where do we think biotech can add value? I guess this is one of these funny slides. Tolerance to higher temperatures. This is basically the gamut of things that we're investing in to help farmers sustainably intensify their production and deal with climate change. Tolerance to higher temperatures, looking at improved photosynthetic efficiency. We can use biotech tools to improve nutritional content through biofortification. Through the use of herbicide-tolerant crops, for example, you can improve weed management and reduce your tillage, also in developing country settings that would be appropriate. We can use water more efficiently, develop some tolerance to moderate drought. I mentioned earlier nitrogen use efficiency as a target trait, and then salt tolerance. For example, we're working with a company and with the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute to develop salt tolerance in rice for Bangladesh. This is just a snapshot of where we have our biotechnology and biosafety programs. As you can see, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. It's a pretty broad portfolio working in a number of different countries. And in a number of these countries, we now have public sector institutions that are doing confined field trials of crops that they've developed in collaboration with US scientists. And that's pretty exciting. And a lot of that, I think, has been due to the partners that we work with and their efforts on the ground to advance both the policies that allow the confined field trials to go forward and the work going into the crop development itself to have something to field trial. So then a few more, going back to our program areas, the program for research on safe and nutritious foods. This program area is looking to increase the availability of and access to nutritious foods like fruits, vegetables, animal-sourced foods, legumes also, but we have a whole program area devoted to that, so we don't cover it here as much. But it's also thinking about, as Rob alluded to, what are the agricultural interventions that will allow you to have nutritional outcomes. Just growing more fruits and vegetables may have no impact on a household's nutritional status. So we're actually supporting research through Tufts University and others on what are the drivers to get that nutritional impact at the household level, particularly for women and children, and how can you achieve that through agriculture? And that's an open question. It's something that we don't have a great evidence base for in a lot of areas, and our research programs are sort of wrapping themselves around our development investments that the missions are making in the field, and are doing really rigorous research to see what is working and what isn't, so that we can design our development programs better in the future to have nutritional outcomes. I mentioned research on nutrition. We have research around horticulture, livestock, aquaculture, and fisheries value chains. We have a new innovation lab on reduction in post-harvest losses led by Kansas State University. So this will be looking at everything from handling and storage to processing, trying to think about the post-harvest aspects that lead to, that can contribute to nutrition or can address issues related to food safety like mycotoxin contamination. We have a program for policy and markets research and support. This is looking to create an agricultural enabling environment that supports development in agriculture. This is around, it can be around inputs policy, around financial instruments. It's working with host country governments. It's working with multilateral institutions. It's providing support on policy and capacity building, and it's also doing policy research to look at what are the different kinds of interventions in the policy space that could lead to the agricultural outcomes we're looking for under Feed the Future. We have a number of programs in this area, a new food security policy innovation lab at Michigan State University, one at UC Davis looking at assets and market access. This is also where we address, I mentioned earlier, the work around improving biosafety regulatory systems. That's covered under this program area as well. We have human institutional capacity development is something that is integrated throughout our programs. Every research program is partnering with partners in developing countries, is often training students and postdocs as part of that, is thinking about how to increase their ability to take on and to do this important research that's needed in their countries. But we also have programs specifically focused on capacity building and are even doing some research on how to build the capacity of institutions to take a leadership role in agricultural research and training. So this is, recognizing that many public agricultural institutions are still quite weak, but that the private sector also needs skilled employees, and in many countries they don't have access to the right human resources base to staff up their companies. Many of the folks that were trained during the heyday of when USAID was investing in agriculture back in the 80s are now, or prior to that, are now retiring, and there's a big gap behind them. There's not a lot of people to fill in the positions that these folks are leaving. And women hold very few management positions, and in some countries hold very few positions at all in the research and training enterprise. So this is about strengthening those institutions and ensuring a pipeline of trained researchers and educators that is going to be able to feed into that, and ensuring that women have a role to play in that process and can in fact take on leadership roles within those countries. And then finally, I'm not going to say too much about the program for sustainable intensification because I'm going to hand it back to Rob, but this is our last program area, and this is where it all comes together. This is where we're looking to really fundamentally transform these key production systems, noting that much agricultural land suffers from both physical and chemical degradation. Yields in many countries where we work are still quite low, and so when we're talking about increasing productivity, we're really talking about it in those areas where farmers are still getting less than 1 ton per hectare of maize yields, for example. And looking to do that through improved varieties and genetics, but also through improved agronomy, through improved policies that give them the access to fertilizers and inputs, through better land tenure policies that allow them to invest in their land. So this is sort of the overarching program area where all our different research inputs come together, and we actually do research on how to transform production systems in major systems around the world. So I'll hand it back to you, Rob, at this point, and he'll take us through to the end.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Callie. Thanks, Saharah Moon. So as Saharah Moon said, the sustainable intensification, which was our overarching goal, is where it all comes together. I just borrowed a few slides to just share some other ways that people are trying to look at this issue. One approach comes out of the Imperial College, where they're thinking about sort of 3 levels of sustainable intensification. One of it being around socioeconomic, some of the issues Saharah Moon mentioned, policies, markets, human capital, and social capital. Ecological intensification. This is a big part of what we're doing. It's where we think about issues like biomass, where we are trying to look for ways for smallholders to integrate livestock, for example, or fish into their farming systems. Conservation agriculture, a big part of it. They list organic farming. That's not something that we tend to promote per se, but it is knowledge intensive, and there is a lot of knowledge intensivity around the kinds of things that we need to have occur in in sustainable intensification. I guess one way of looking at what we're trying to do here is that African agriculture in particular is undercapitalized. And it's going to happen somehow. The agricultural systems in Africa are going to change. The question is how. Will it be through mega investments coming out of the Far East or the Middle East, where large swaths of land are taken and people are pushed off? That's one way to capitalize things. It's unlikely, we think, to lead to the social and human welfare outcomes that we're trying to reach at the end of the day, the poverty reduction, the stunting reduction, and so forth. So a lot of what we're trying to do here in putting it all together is to figure out how to help smallholders increase their productivity, increase the stability of that productivity, reduce their risk, foster investment, and also by providing some of those solutions, also see how the policy investment, the roads, the infrastructure, the marketing approaches that they have no control over can also be advanced. And it's really trying to do those 2 things together. I should have mentioned this first. The third area, of course, is something that we've been talking about all morning with the genetic intensification. Again, these are some of our traditional tools. Another way of thinking about this, and this is from Ken Kassman and others, and this is looking at what's happened in South Asia versus sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see in South Asia, over time, the yield, the area has not gone up so much. It's the yield that has really grown. And that has been a prescription for poverty reduction and gains. In Africa, as Saharah Moon said, we've been at sort of 1 ton per hectare of maize for a long time. And so what we've seen is extensification. The production growth has come out of more land coming into play. But it's not through higher productivity that's going to drive the outcomes at the human level and household level that we would like to see. So we would like to make the sub-Saharan Africa graph look more like that from South Asia. And what is that? Oh, Hans. I'm going to call on a colleague to say a little bit more. Many of you probably heard Hans yesterday, but Hans is going to say another important message that I don't think he included yesterday, but is at the heart of what we're trying to do.
Right. I say what you just said in a different way. Yesterday I made 2 visual mistakes in my presentation, and one of them was to list some of the people we, Simit and Cornell, is affiliated with, and I forgot some. And one of them was Peter, and there are many more, and in the future I will do it. The second thing was I was invited by the Department of Genetics and Breeding, so I mainly talked about genetic interventions, but usually I make a very important point, and this is, it relates to the importance of agronomy. And I have to say, About 15 years ago, the CGIAR nearly had decided that agronomy is not important. The investments 15 years ago in agronomy came extremely low within the CGIAR, and that was a big mistake. And by then I was very, very critical. The argument by then was agronomy is site-specific and should be done by national programs. National programs then concluded the CGIAR has decided agronomy is not important, so we can also close because agronomy is not important. And this is absolutely was a strategic mistake. Today, in my opinion, we go a little bit too much to the other side. Now, though, within the CGIAR, I think relative to research investments and systems investments, there is now an overinvestment in systems because systems depend on progress from research in the future, and we have to come a little bit more to a balance. But that relates to the CGIAR. But what I wanted to say here is that related to agronomy, what we do is, and I relate this to cars, we invest billions of dollars in developing beautiful cars, and then this is from Germany, we develop beautiful highways to exploit the speed of the car, right? It allows you really to take the potential. We develop beautiful weeds, and then we grow them in miserable fields. And this is not functioning, and that is why this is a slide from Mexico where you have the conventional farmer system, and this here is if you take improved technologies. And I think we have to do both. We have to invest in agronomy together with breeding. I think it's obvious, but not always. And sometimes, and I'm a breeder, but sometimes I think the promises which are made from the genetics are too high without recognizing that you have to invest accordingly in agronomy to use it. And for me, as a rule of thumb, what I really like the last slide because it basically, I say it much simpler here than the Imperial College, but I think in the future there will be, the balance on a global scale will be 1/3 breeding, 1/3 agronomy, and 1/3 policy. And there are big shifts. The poorer the conditions, the more important become policy and agronomy. The higher the yield, the bigger impact you have also from breeding. As a rule of thumb, there are exceptions, but all of them have to go together. And if you look at the impact, Africa still suffers tremendously from poor policy. If Africa would becoming more relaxed on fertilizer prices, for example, I think you could see already there a big impact. And then you can take the potential from the other crops. If I see what my maize colleagues do in Africa, and you see the potential of the maize varieties under the right conditions, and then you see what farmers get, it's a tremendous gap, and that needs to be closed, and I hope we can do this in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Hans. And I mean, that tremendous gap is also looked at as tremendous opportunity. So that's so this question of how do we help smallholders make a transition from a high-risk, low resource and low information, low market access environment to one that allows them to benefit from the transformational outcomes of the various breeding agronomy and policy. I just wanted to say a little bit more about expanding our engagement with the U.S. university community. We had a large RFA on the street last year. I guess, yeah, I think it was last year. And we've awarded a whole set of new grants. Part of it was to bring universities into areas where we didn't have a lot going with them. And for example, in some of the climate resilience work that Saharah Moon talked about, we had a lot of partnerships with the private sector where we can leverage great technology, but we also wanted to engage the U.S. universities with us in that. There's a few of the areas that we looked at in terms of the university involvement were the climate resilient crops, the livestock health, small-scale irrigation, again, part of reducing risk, increasing productivity for smallholders, post-harvest loss reduction, and food security policy. So these were areas that were not as prominent in our existing university partnerships. And we wanted to do this in a way that linked our university investments much more closely than they'd been in the past with the CGIAR investments, and in some cases with private sector investments. So this is something we're very proud of. We just awarded this to the University of Illinois, Missouri, and Mississippi State. For decades, we couldn't touch soy because of the experience with Brazil and the U.S. soy community not wanting us to be helping the competition. But soy is a critical crop emerging opportunity, and it's coming in Africa, and we want to see if we can find a way to help smallholders access it. And it's the whole value chain we're looking at. it's certainly, we're interested in the food outcomes, and some of those in West Africa are substantial, and they can address some of the opportunities we'd like to see around availability of legumes and other high-quality foods. But the bigger driver is probably the demand for livestock feed, for poultry especially. So this is something we're excited about. It's brand new, but again, it adds nitrogen in terms of the soil fertility. It's got a ready market. There's just a lot about it to be excited about. So that's one. Saharah Moon already mentioned a couple of the grants that came out of this around heat tolerance and Newcastle's in poultry and Rift Valley fever. These were some of the things that were involved that we included in the RFA but didn't actually make grants on. Post-harvest losses, non-horticultural, and as it turns out, we don't really have a fish element in what we're going to be doing, but we are working, as she said, with Kansas State, looking to see how we can both reduce waste and also improve quality. This is another new lab that was awarded to Texas A&M University in cooperation with the International Water Management Institute, which is a CGIAR center based in Sri Lanka. Lots of issues here, many of them policy, a lot of them about how to make capital affordable. There are a lot of technologies out there where you have relatively available water, axial flow pumps and such that are very efficient. There's a lot of ways that you can see small scale service providers providing, and one thing I saw that was really cool in Nigeria last year was in Nigeria there are people with little motorbikes that are everywhere. Everybody has them, or not everybody has them, but they're everywhere. And you can buy a small pump in China that attaches to the motorbike and pumps water up, say, 15 feet or so onto a field. Well, that's a tremendous opportunity for where there is surface water in terms of reduced drudgery and increased productivity in a way that a smallholder can access and a service provider can actually invest in and grow a service that's going to take us all in the right direction. We also are excited about the opportunities around biomass increase, a small amount of water. We're not talking about whole irrigated fields, but what if a farmer, what if she could keep a 1/20 of a hectare with water throughout the year so that she could keep her planting material for sweet potato vines alive over the dry season, so she could have some horticultural crops both for home consumption and to sell. These kinds of things, they're incremental, but we think there are opportunities, and we think they're going to come, so it's how they come that we're focused on. This is the whole list of the innovation labs, I think 24 altogether? 23. And you can see they're grouped. I suppose that you may not be able to read all of this, but we got a broad swath of response from the university community. And they cross over all 6 areas. I would say that the 7th area, the human and institutional capacity development, those programs are also led by universities. Virginia Tech in alliance with Pennsylvania State, Florida, and others in agricultural curricula, training, institutional development, and Iowa, Illinois, and many partners on extension and advisory services. We mentioned the fact that our missions are investing in value chain, where they take a fairly narrow focus from front to end. Now, it sounds like the Gates Foundation may be going that way as well, looking at sort of a vertically integrated approach around a commodity. So we've tried to figure out how our research investments, whether they be at the on-farm productivity, the post-harvest and marketing, or ultimately at utilization, fit around that. And again, it's this idea of wrapping ourselves around what the missions are doing, but also, I would say, trying to broaden their thinking to the system level. Because the problem with a narrow value chain approach is that it can be just that, it can be narrow. So if a mission is working on maize, and we can bring in soy as a rotation crop, or if they're working on wheat and we can bring in lentils or chickpea as a rotation crop, that farmer may want to grow those anyway, but we can bring in better genetics, or we can bring in better agronomy. So it's an opportunity to I think, enhance the outcomes in ways that feed back into better outcomes from the value chains. The maize will have better yields if it's got a legume growing in rotation. Just a quick comment on gender. I mentioned earlier how this is across our portfolio. I think it's about women as economic actors at the end of the day. It's also about women as leaders, but in particular economic actors and decision makers. The other thing I think that isn't always intuitive is that men have to be part of a gender approach. And we've talked to our friend Krista Jacobs about coming up here to give a seminar on a much more in-depth view of how we're looking at gender in our program. So more to come on that one. Finally, Dr. Shah, our administrator, has, I think, challenged the entire community that's thinking about this, about, well, why aren't our technologies getting out? And he is pushing us to do what he calls scaling technologies. And this is where we are trying to sort of accelerate the connection between the kinds of investments our missions are making and what's coming out of our research programs. So instead of focusing, we're trying to, using a push, connect those research outcomes to the demand that our missions can impose through their partners in the respective countries. And we hope that this is going to really drive outputs and impacts from our programs in a way that in a couple years hence, when we come time to take stock, that we will really see that this investment has been worthwhile, and importantly, that the future leadership of AID or the US government or the World Bank or elsewhere are going to want to continue to invest in agriculture. And this is one thing we're doing with that. We have to get the policies of the market analyses right as well, but this is a big push for us now. And finally, the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. This is what followed the first commitments at the G8 level, very much focused on scaling seeds and technologies, also focused on policy changes, and Hans pointed out that the need for that. So we see that going along, also bringing in new things like information and communications technologies to help accelerate small farmers getting the information they need. It's not just technology, it's also information about markets, weather, et cetera. And we have a great website, feedthefuture.gov. Please avail yourselves of it, and I know Ronnie and Sarah can put you in touch with Saharah Moon or me or many of our colleagues, and thanks for coming.
Yeah.